Many thanks for inviting me across here to Dublin to speak to you today about our experience of dealing with disaster at Glasgow School of Art. I will warn you that the talk starts off a little bit depressing, obviously, and then as it progresses, hopefully you'll find it becoming a bit more positive as it goes on. I must admit to finding myself much more at home here today, surrounded by librarians, than where I usually am when I'm doing this talk. And until you've had a disaster, you don't realise that there's this whole disaster circuit which you're very quickly co-opted onto once you've had a disaster. And the other thing that nobody tells you as well is that all the people that work on this disaster circuit are all former SAS soldiers who have then gone into security or risk assessment and so forth. So the last time I did this course, I was sandwiched between a guy that had just come back from a 6-month tour of Basra, and another guy, he was the former personal bodyguard of Bill Clinton. So I'm much more at home today in this milieu. Oh. Sorry, I'm struggling to deal with the progression of the slides here. Yeah. It's not as easy as just pressing an arrow.
It's not.
Yeah.
Oh, no. That's wrong.
Yeah. Okay. So it's that, that one there?
Yeah.
Oh, right, okay. Yeah. Okay, right, so I'll start with a bit of a historical digression. In his treatise, The Enemies of Books, which was first published in 1880, William Blades, who was a well-known collector of the works of William Caxton and a bit of a bibliophile, he documents his outrage at the mistreatment suffered by books at the hands of biblioclasts, both human and non-human. So he's got chapters in this book on water, gas and heat, dust and neglect, ignorance and bigotry, bookworms, and then a whole section on vermin, under which he places servants and children. But he does have a chapter on fire, and he begins, there are many of the forces of nature which tend to injure books, but among them, all not one has been half so destructive as fire. And he goes on, it would be tedious to write out a bare list only of the numerous libraries and bibliographical treasures which in one way or another have been seized by the Fire King as his own. I've got to tell you, someone has actually done this. There is a Wikipedia page of libraries destroyed by fire, on which we appeared about half an hour after our fire. So someone's really got their finger on the pulse when it comes to that. And this engraved illustration is taken from Blades' text and depicts the destruction of books of magic at Ephesus. So on the 23rd of May 2014, the Fire King struck at the Glasgow School of Art and totally destroyed the world-famous Macintosh Library and its important historical collections, which you can see on the slide here. And the devastating fire was widely reported and discussed at the time and continues to feature prominently as the school moves from a period of rescue and salvage towards a period of rebirth and reconstruction. For those of you that never had the opportunity to visit the library in person, or perhaps know of it only fleetingly, I'll do my best to describe some of its significance. It was generally accepted as one of the finest Art Nouveau interiors internationally. And any visitor to the space could not help but be moved by its architectural and aesthetic beauty. Very small, not a large library at all, but very important in the history of architecture, particularly Art Nouveau and Scottish architecture. So it had hand-painted balusters, pierced wooden pendants were suspended throughout the library, and these beautiful coloured glass hanging lamps which hang down from the centre of the library in a chandelier formation. To all its original tables and Windsor chairs, and to its periodicals desk, which really formed a kind of central motif, really, in the centre of the library. How many of you here ever visited oh, there's a few of you, actually, that had chance to see it. Okay, that's good. So the library was designed by architect and former student of Glasgow School of Art, Charles Rennie Mackintosh, between 1907 and 1909. For those of you that haven't been to Glasgow, Charles Rennie Mackintosh is to Glasgow what James Joyce is to Dublin. You know, you can't escape the guy. He's there. And he designed the building as part of the second phase of the art school, which he had first designed in 1896. Basically, they ran out of money, so they had to stop halfway along, and then the library came about 10 years later in the second half of the building that he designed. This postcard view of the library by an unknown photographer dates to soon after completion in 1909, and it's taken from the school's archives. I'll tell you a little bit about the conservation ethos that we have later on, but suffice to say the main thrust of the ethos is that the library is going to be returned back as far as possible to Mackintosh's original design, so very similar to the design you see here, taking out all of the kind of insertions that have been added over the years. Writing on the symbolic allusions of Mackintosh's design, James Macaulay, in his authoritative 1993 Phaidon account of the building, states that the library of the Glasgow School of Art is not only an aesthetic experience, but the translation of philosophical thought into 3 dimensions. Architectural historians love to talk like that. The building as a whole has been described by Sir Christopher Frayling, who is rector of the Royal College of Art in London, as the only art school in the world where the building is worthy of the subject. This is a work of art in which to make works of art. Okay, so bear in mind those images that you saw a couple of slides ago of the Macintosh Library as it was. Unhappily, on the 23rd of May 2014, all these unique and beautiful spaces were totally destroyed by fire. And these photographs of the destroyed library were taken 2 days after that fire. So by this point, the fire brigade had announced that the building was safe for us to enter into. So 2 days after the fire. And they were taken with my camera phone, so the resolution's pretty low, but it will give you a sense of the sheer extent of the destruction, really. I mean, it was total. And the remains of the columns, which once led to the mezzanine level of the library, I think hopefully you'll still be able to see standing there to the left. And to the right, the ferocity of the fire is evidenced by how the wood facing has been completely stripped back to bare brick. You can see that on the right-hand side. Originally, all that was clad in wood. You couldn't see that brick at all, but it's all been completely burnt back. But of course, everyone gathered here will know that any historic library is more than just an architectural space alone. We also lost many treasured, irreplaceable collections in the fire, including books dating back to the 16th century, rare avant-garde journals in the arts and design, and 19th century illustrated books by our former staff and alumni. This view shows the former library bookstore, which had latterly been used as a furniture store, looking down through the rafters into the library below. So we're at the level above the library, looking down through those gaps in the rafters, down into the library. And sadly, much of the school's art collections were stored in this space directly above the library, and so again were irretrievably lost. This included the vast majority of our paintings, some decorative arts, and items of Macintosh furniture, which were not then on display in our public furniture gallery, which was elsewhere in the building. And here I think you should be able to see, you should be able to make out the metal skeletons of the former painting racks. And before the fire, all of those were chock full of paintings. And in the fire, obviously, the paintings have just disappeared completely. They've just been burnt away. And another view of the store with some of the destroyed canvases propped up against the wall on the right-hand side. In total, the majority of these canvases were totally destroyed, so about 92 canvases from a total collection of 122. Many represented the work of former students and staff of the school. On the left-hand side, you can see Nude with a Wrap by Maurice Griefenhagen, dating to 1924. He was a former head of painting at Glasgow School of Art. And then on the right-hand side, a more contemporary work from 1970, Pan by Carol Gibbons, who was another GSA graduate and went on to quite an accomplished career in Scottish art. The lost paintings can still be viewed on our Archives and Collections catalogue, but with their destroyed status noted, and they do continue to appear on the Art UK website, which is an online catalogue of the entire art holdings of all UK public institutions. Now, in hindsight, the storing of an entire collection in a single vulnerable location was, of course, problematic, but most of you will understand the compromises that inevitably become necessary when working in historical legacy buildings, where space is always at a premium and always contested. In total, some 139 pieces of original Macintosh furniture were also lost. Many of these pieces were duplicates of pieces which were on display in our public furniture gallery, which was to a large extent unaffected by the fire. It was right at the other end of the building. But a small number of pieces were unique and so were forever lost. The school's historical archives, quite miraculously actually, escaped the fire, despite the fact that they were housed in the basement level of the building, actually right next door to the very studio where the fire started. So they were right next door, and yet they seemed to sort of somehow miraculously avoid at least the worst of the fire. Throughout the building, hidden voids had been inserted to carry building services such as heating, ventilation, and plant. And many of these voids were completely unknown to us or our statespeople until, obviously, the fire has now laid them so evidently bare. And indeed, the official report from the fire brigade, noted that it was really these voids that acted as the principal route for the fire to spread throughout the building once it had taken hold. And this meant that the route of the fire was mainly vertical rather than lateral. So it started off in the basement and then went straight up, right up into the Macintosh Library, which was almost directly above, rather than sideways laterally. And this, of course, was to the benefit of our archives, but ultimately to the detriment of the Macintosh Library. So, you know, what we lost in one area, we were protected in another area. Our archives include a wide range of material relating to GSA's history, activities, buildings, staff, and students. And material ranges from paper archives, photographs, sketchbooks, textiles, architectural designs, posters, ceramics. And the sheer variety of artifact obviously complicated subsequent salvage and conservation efforts. We were faced with multiple media and artifact types in the immediate aftermath of the fire, which meant that conservators from across specialisms needed to be engaged. So we weren't just dealing with books and paper here, we were dealing with lots of different artifacts from across all the artistic media. Our archives, although I said they were safe and survived the fire, they did obviously suffer significant water and smoke damage during the subsequent firefighting efforts. So a lot of the damage was caused principally by water from the hoses rather than the fire itself. It was surprising, however, the extent to which our bespoke conservation boxes minimised the water damage suffered by these collections. Many of you in your own collections, certainly some of you that have the more sort of historical collections, will recognise these sort of inexpensive cardboard boxes that you buy to fit your collections, and you look at them and think, well, that's not going to do much good in a disaster. But actually, they offered a surprising amount of protection. With the total loss of the library all too apparent, our main priority quickly became the salvage of these damaged archives. And our departmental disaster plan provided us with an important overarching framework to guide our activities and decisions. It outlined for us, for example, how to respond initially to the disaster, how to salvage different types of material, how to prioritize between artifacts, and perhaps most importantly, how to designate the different team roles that had suddenly now become necessary in this aftermath of disaster. Now, it's probably fair to say that the documents comprising our disaster plan were perhaps of limited use on the ground, where events do tend to take on a dynamic of their own. I can't claim that we were consulting our disaster plan left, right and centre, but I do think that probably formulating the plans in the first place probably did help to crystallise in our minds somewhere the decision-making processes that we would need to go through. Of particular use were the building and floor plans, which helped us to explain to authorities and volunteers alike where particular collections were housed. We did find that the firemen in particular were amenable to bringing stuff out of the building for us if we were able to show them exactly where something incredibly important was located. Obviously, their main priority was about the safety of the building and firefighting, but where they were able to help us in the salvage effort, they certainly did so. We were also aided in our salvage efforts by many volunteers, including, I have to say, many of our academics who willingly volunteered their time to help us. And we were, of course, very humbled by the goodwill shown to us during this time and by the generosity of those who gave their time and support to us. It became apparent incredibly quickly how important it is, really, to maintain a good roster of volunteers who are able to help at this time. We're a very small institution. We're only 2,000 people, students and staff. We don't have huge staff cohorts on permanent retention. We tend to be quite a skeleton organisation in lots of ways. So we do rely on these groups of volunteers helping us out a lot, actually. And of course, the importance of the close relationships we built up with our teaching colleagues over a number of years became obvious. We were able to draw upon the many close relationships, indeed, I would say friendships, actually, that we had cultivated with our academics over the years. So for about 3 days after the fire, it was all hands to the pump as we formed human chains to remove the damaged artefacts. On the advice of conservators and the many other institutions who offered us their guidance at this time, we salvaged almost anything that looked as if it could potentially be of interest. So here, for example, you can see the remains of a painting, not looking much like a painting anymore, unfortunately. No retention or discard decisions were made at this point. In fact, I mean, looking back, we invariably salvaged lots and lots of items that ultimately were of no use or value to us in the conservation effort at all. But at this stage, we were, to an extent, working blind. It's important to remember, of course, that at this point, the building had no electricity running into it, and many of the basement stores we were salvaging from had no source of natural light or ventilation. They always bung the archives right down in the basement, don't they? Because, you know, they put you in the spaces that nobody else wants. So they're very dark spaces without electricity to help you. The Macintosh building is an A-listed structure. I'm not sure what the system is in Ireland, but in the UK, well, in Scotland actually, A listing is the highest level of listed building. So almost immediately after the fire, our colleagues from Historic Environment Scotland, who are the statutory agency, were on site. They recognised that this was a major event that needed their attention. And they obviously remained keen to salvage even small details that might later fill in blanks over the construction of this space. So things such as nails and copper wires and light switches and that kind of stuff, they were really keen to retain all of this material. And another view of the human chain leading from the Macintosh Library down to our temporary decant space, the McClellan Galleries, which I'll talk a little bit about in a moment. So luckily we were able to lease the nearby vacant McClellan Galleries very quickly from Glasgow City Council in order to salvage store our salvaged remains. The galleries are a kind of suite of Victorian exhibition rooms that at the time were closed to the public and not in use. So our director of the institution was able very quickly to get on the phone to the Lord Provost and organise the use of that space for us to decant into. And this is a view of the interior of one of the galleries with some of our institutional records salvaged from the basement of the Macintosh building. We were also lucky to have sizable on-site areas in which to sort and rest our damaged archives. Phase 1 of our campus redevelopment had just been completed, literally about 2 weeks before the fire, I think, with the opening of our new Reed building, which is located directly across the road from the Macintosh building. They face onto one another. And this meant that we had large areas of floor space and a number of seminar rooms that we could use. Had the fire happened a year previous, when that building was still being built, who knows where we would have stored all of this stuff. The fire also occurred in May, towards the end of our academic year, and had it occurred earlier in the year during core teaching weeks, we may not have been able, obviously, to requisition so much space so quickly, although the executive of the institution had made the decision very quickly to close all school buildings and close down all learning and teaching activities for a week, to enable staff to concentrate on this salvage effort. I should make mention here of how our students were affected by these events as well. Most of our students in May are busy preparing for their graduation show, where they show the artwork that they've been creating for the course of their 4-year degree. It's the kind of their way of debuting onto the art stage, if you like, and it's certainly a rite of passage for most of them. But obviously in the fire, several had found a total of 4 years' work destroyed in the fire. So very, very upsetting for them. And this obviously affected our students both academically but also psychologically. So the executive made the decision that students were given the option of graduating with their interim assessment if they wished, if they could not face the prospect of having to recreate their work, for example. But importantly, Phoenix bursaries of 6 months were given by the school to every student who wished to recreate their work. So this funding enabled them to stay in Glasgow for 6 months later than otherwise they perhaps would have done, and also gave them funding to recreate their work so that they could then have their own degree show 6 months later, which I think actually, our institution, as all institutions, sometimes falls down when it comes to communication with students. That's the nature of institutions. But I do think that actually in this case that the school acted in really exemplary fashion, actually. And I think the students were very grateful and appreciative of that approach that was taken on their behalf. We were aided in our salvage efforts by the Glasgow Area Disaster Planning Network, and this group was initiated in 2004 and holds regular meetings, organises training events, and offers help to its members should a disaster occur. Each member organisation is asked to sign an operational agreement and to submit their disaster plans. And we were able to draw, therefore, upon the expertise and skills of many experts across Scotland because of this membership. And this proved particularly important for a small organisation like ours, which does not normally retain conservators on its payroll. Scotland, of course, like Ireland, is a small country with quite a concentrated population, about 5 million, I think, in Scotland, and we all subsequently draw incredibly heavily upon informal and formal networks that we belong to. Of most benefit to us were the organisational and logistical roles that could be assumed by others, such as phoning external companies, responding to inquiries, and planning rotas. So all of the kind of mundane logistics that just needed to be done. The initial salvage priority quickly became the paper and textile archives, as evidently these were the most vulnerable to long-term water damage. Here you can see some textiles from our archives being laid out to dry. Once materials were salvaged, sorted, dried as far as possible and recorded, they were packed for transportation to temporary storage with Constantines, which is a kind of art logistics company based just outside Glasgow. The items that required freezing were sent to Harwells in Oxfordshire. And we were aided in this process by specialist textile conservators from the University of Glasgow, which is a much bigger institution than we are ourselves. And for paper records, we were assisted by the National Records of Scotland. Today, happily, all of our textiles are fully dry and are now back on site in the centre of Glasgow. The school also possesses a sizable collection of plaster casts of classical and medieval sculptures, and these were all purchased in the 19th century for students to draw from. These are much like the casts you may have seen in places like the cast courts in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. I've not had a chance to look around the gallery here, but I wouldn't be surprised if in some of the galleries here there were these sort of plaster casts dotted about. Very common pedagogical tool in 19th century arts education. Subsequently, in the fire, many became cracked and blackened. Some of the smaller casts were removed from the building by specialists and are now housed off-site at their premises until the building reopens and they can move back. But the larger casts were too big, really, for us to move outside of the building, and they're currently still in situ in the building with workmen working around them, boxed. And this was really advice taken from the Victoria and Albert Museum. They really advised that to try to move these large plaster casts would actually cause more damage than just leaving them boxed in situ in a building as it's being restored. Only one plaster cast was lost entirely, and that's the one that had been in the Macintosh Library, and you saw the level of destruction, so it's not surprising that that plaster cast was lost. Actually, it being an art school, I mean, our students come up with all kinds of incredibly interesting ways of looking at the world, and our students have become really quite fascinated by several of these sculptures, because a lot of them display very archetypal Greek ideas of the body beautiful. And of course, in the fire, a lot have become so blackened that we have, for example, a Venus de Milo, who has now essentially become, in the student's eyes, a black woman. So this transformation from this idea of this kind of very Western-centric view of beauty and the transformation of that sculpture into now a black body is something that the students have really engaged with on a learning and teaching level. And I think actually a few of the plaster casts might be kept in their blackened form because there is so much interest in this. A major milestone came with the excavation of the library interior. Due to the art historical importance of the library, Historic Environment Scotland really required us to undertake a full archaeological investigation. And the school employed the services of Kirkdale Archeology to do this on its behalf. The archaeologists undertook a painstaking and systematic excavation based on 1 metre square grids, and they excavated down in columns at 25 centimetre increments, and each stratum was photographed and recorded. And any salvaged artefacts were recorded following established methodologies before removal for treatment and conservation. It was a fascinating process for me to watch, actually, having never really had much encounter with archaeology as a discipline. It was fascinating to watch them at work and how they go about and record these things. We formulated decision trees to help us decide which salvaged materials we should keep and which we should dispose of. I should say this excavation started several months after the fire. So you've had the fire, several months had passed whilst the building was made safe. And then the excavation starts several months down the line, by which point a lot of water has come in. The Glasgow climate is not that different from the Dublin climate, so a lot of water has come in. There's no roof on the building, so you can imagine a lot of mould growth. We developed separate trees for each media, so one for paper and books, one for metalwork, one for glass, etc. And these trees were then reviewed and approved by colleagues in Museums and Galleries Scotland. Having these guidelines meant that our decisions were consistent across individuals, but also were totally transparent and accountable. And we were very much thinking about how we recorded for future generations the decision-making processes that we were going about, because the decisions we make now and have made as part of this process will be of interest to these historians, I'm sure, in 100 years' time. Here you can see just a small percentage of the 10,000 books that were hitherto housed in that library, awaiting disposal and retention assessment. So me and my colleague David, we would go across each day to see what the archaeologists had pulled out that day. We got dressed up in our best village people builders outfits, about 3 sizes too big in my case, looking completely ridiculous. It was not the highlight of my career, I have to say, going through this day in, day out, but it was a necessary process. Perhaps surprisingly, some books did survive the fire, despite those scenes of utter devastation that you saw earlier. And it seemed really to depend on where they were situated within the library and the amount of oxygen available to the fire, and also actually whether the books were tightly or loosely packed on the shelves. You know, when you go to these conservation courses and they tell you you absolutely must not cram your books onto the shelves, because this will do all kinds of untold damage to the bindings of your books. And most of us know that we work in libraries where we never have enough space, and invariably you are cramming things onto the shelves. Actually, it was the books that were crammed on the shelves that were protected, because there was no space around them for the oxygen to get in, so that they were protected somewhat from the fire. But you can see the extent of the mould growth and everything that had populated these books by the time we got to them. Although the books themselves were sometimes difficult to identify immediately, our barcodes, which we use as distinguishing marks in all of our books, again, this is something that no conservator would ever tell you to do, to stick a plastic barcode inside a 16th century book. We did. But I have to say, these barcodes, miraculously, so I mean, they're absolutely indestructible from what I can make out. So all we had to do really was give each book a bit of a clean and open them up, and mostly they could be opened up, and the barcode was there, and we could look it up in our catalogue, and we knew exactly what it was that we were dealing with. In subsequent months, we undertook a cost-benefit analysis for each volume, taking into account the replacement costs on the open market to decide which books to conserve and which to source anew. You are not going to conserve everything that you salvage because it is just not going to be economically viable for you to do that. So obviously you're making a judgment call as to does a particular book have some kind of relevance to our collection beyond its cost out on the open market. So does it have some kind of interesting provenance, for example, that means we would want to hold on to it? It's undeniable, however, that we did lose a significant proportion of the school's foundation collections, which came to us in the 19th century. We were formed as an institution in 1847, and most of them came to us from the then South Kensington Museum, which is now the Victoria and Albert Museum. And this obviously constitutes a great loss to the school's institutional history. We did, however, have some miraculous survivors, such as this 19th century photographic volume of topographical views of Japan, complete in its original silk covers. This was one of the books that was in a cardboard conservation box. So it really did its job, that box. Our conservation approach with these books has been to stabilise but to retain evidence of the fire and its damage. We now view this as an important part of the history of these volumes. And this, I think, really reflects the teaching and research methodologies of the school as an institution. Some of you in other institutions would take very different approaches. But for us, we always place emphasis as an institution upon material culture, object analysis, and materiality. And indeed, one of our PhD candidates is now basing her entire PhD thesis on the phenomenological qualities of these salvaged volumes. She's very interested, for example, in the mould growth. She's been doing a lot of work comparing the mould growth to Rorschach blots, used in psychology, for example. And she's very interested in the scent, the aroma, the sort of odour, burnt library. She's very interested in all those kind of experiential qualities of these books. So our conservation ethos was very much stabilised, but we leave these books with these experiential qualities. One of the areas our disaster plan failed to touch upon adequately was social media, and in the immediate aftermath, we were particularly struck by the importance and pressures of these communication channels. It's telling, perhaps, that most disaster plans that I've encountered fail to mention the extent to which your staff will be inundated with offers of support, guidance, and donations from others through Twitter, Facebook, and the like. In our experience, it's really important to think now about who you would designate for this role should something like this occur. This person will need to have an understanding of the subtle etiquettes of social media, and will need to understand the approach to media relations that your particular institution has. And the relationships you're able to cultivate now over social media will pay huge dividends for you later. We received significant offers of donations to our library, and keen to capitalise on this goodwill, we recognised that it provided an opportunity for us to begin to rebuild our lost collections very quickly. So we published a wants list on our website of about 700 volumes, so 700 from the 10,000 that we had lost, that we really wanted to replace as a priority because they had a kind of significance to our learning and teaching activities and also the history of the school. And within, I think, about 3 months, we had managed to replace 22% of those 700 volumes, purely through the generosity of other institutions and individuals. And I'd certainly like to express my thanks today to all of those Irish institutions gifted us volumes from your own collections to replace those lost in ours. We worked closely with our colleagues in the press office to publicise our collection's rebuild campaign. The article on the left appeared in the Herald, the main newspaper in Scotland, on the 15th of September 2014 to celebrate our receiving 22% of our priority volumes in 3 months. We also enjoyed coverage in The Times, BBC News, Telegraph, Design Week and The Guardian. And to the left is my colleague, or my then colleague, Jennifer, accepting a donation of a rare Glasgow-style book binding by Anne Macbeth, who was the GSA head of embroidery in the 1920s, which was purchased on our behalf by the Antiquarian Booksellers Association. All of this, I hasten to add, was achieved at zero cost to the institution and demonstrates, I think, what can be achieved through collaboration, outreach and engagement with your sector. As befits an art school, responses to the fire have been fearless, experimental and doggedly forward-looking. And we have certainly delighted in facilitating many of the artistic responses. This is Jim Lambie's psychedelic soul stick, number 79, which incorporates charcoal extracted from the Macintosh Library's burnt collections, including remnants of Muirhead Bone's 50 drawings of Glasgow, which was published in 1911, and rather poignantly includes a plate of the Macintosh Library being constructed. So it's quite a nice circle, that plate being integrated within this artwork. This bookwork 51170 by Erin Scott and Kate Loudon references the original library accession number of a volume that was damaged in the fire but subsequently we decided to dispose of. Its images are collected from a men's fashion magazine published in the 1970s and that was stored in the library's mezzanine, and you can obviously see that the pages had suffered both fire and water damage. So quite nice that they took those images and incorporated them into a new bookwork, which we have now acquired for our collection and will go back into the Macintosh Library. So quite a nice circle. And in Ross Birrell's A Beautiful Living Thing, a single musician sits within the shell of the damaged library and writes a specially written lament. It was performed by Bill Chandler of the Royal Scottish National Orchestra in late December 2014. At that time, the fire's debris was still very much in situ, and this provided a unique temporary acoustic within that space. The film of the performance, I'm sorry, it's not publicly available, so I can only show you this still, but it's actually it's very mournful in a way, but also very forward-looking and positive. But it starts in silence on the first floor of the Macintosh building, takes the viewer very slowly into the Macintosh Library, where you see Bill performing this lament on the violin. And then it backtracks out of the library and goes up onto the roof level of the library and looks out across the cityscape of Glasgow. I'm getting quite emotional, actually, discussing this. It's a very emotional piece, if you ever were to see it. So immediately after the fire, there was wide public debate about the future of the Macintosh building and its spaces, and this very much concerned the ethics of restoration, the relationship between the original and the replica, and the avoidance of a kind of Macintosh aesthetic. And the debates were lively and stimulating. They were, I would have to say, sometimes difficult psychologically for those of us who had worked with and cherished these spaces. It's, of course, within the very DNA of academics to challenge perceived wisdoms and act as devil's advocate. They see that as part of their important identity and role in society. But some of the intense debate in the immediate aftermath, when people were still really grieving their loss, could, in hindsight, have been more sensitively handled. I'm not referring to the institutional response here. I'm dealing to the response of individuals. As managers, you will need to remain aware of these kinds of the kinds of emotional labours that are demanded of your staff in these situations. The photo here was taken on Monday and shows the restoration of the library being undertaken. So the library is due to finish in January 2019, where we get the keys back. So under a year now. So the architects are busy restoring the space as we speak. And that's a prototype bay of the Macintosh Library, which was mocked up by our carpenters in the big sort of aircraft hangar-like space on the outskirts of Edinburgh. and two of the craftspeople who have been involved in the carving of the pendants and the painting of the wood and so forth. So they've done an amazing job. It's going to look amazing when it comes back. So to finish, understanding anew the early history of Macintosh Library and its collections allows us today to reconceptualise the function of this space as we prepare for reoccupation in 2019. So for the first time in the school's history, all the library's special and rare collections will be relocated to this single space, where they will be significantly more visible and accessible to students and external researchers. The former bookstore above the library will become a dedicated reading room where students can request and view items from our collections as diverse as artist books, 19th century design folios and illustrated books. And central to the vision of the new library is that it will act as a kind of incubator for new creative practice through exposure to these exquisite and unusual collections. So as I said, the Macintosh building and its library remains on track to reopen to students and the public, I think from September 2019. And we invite you all to visit us in Glasgow at that time to experience this amazing space reborn. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Duncan. We have time just for a few questions, if there are any.
Thanks, Duncan. My name is Michelle Breen from the University of Limerick. It's a harrowing story and I hadn't heard it before. Just wonder if the experience that you had has gone to inform national policy in Scotland through SCURL or through any other national agency regarding the protection, I suppose, and disaster response within the library sector.
I think it probably has, but probably in quite an informal way. We've certainly presented on the fire and its aftermath at several events, including many SCURL events, and also to the Scottish Government. Historic Environment Scotland are obviously very interested in the lessons for this fire in terms of protecting other historic buildings. They do tend to come to it from a kind of architectural perspective. Obviously, we come to it from a slightly different perspective. We're as interested in the collections from our viewpoint as we are in the spaces. But so certainly we've communicated that what we have learned from the experience quite widely across Scotland, and it's nice to be able to come to Ireland and extend that outreach we've been doing. So I'm sure that lots of people have learned. I do know that lots of institutions have reviewed their own disaster plan. We've had many of them come to us and sit down with us and actually show us their disaster plan and say, okay, would this have worked in your situation, or actually does this need reworking? So hopefully the message is getting out there, and I do think as well in next year in 2019, when the building reopens, I think that the debate again will kick up as well, and there'll be a lot more debate.
Okay. Any more questions? There's one here, Niamh, and one at the back. I think that's probably all we'll have time for. Yeah.
Hi, Mary Tracy here. I'm from the Institute of Public Administration.
Okay.
Thanks, it was lovely, interesting. I think maybe a lot more people will wonder why the beautiful video that you talked about isn't publicly available.
Yeah.
Because I'd love to see it if possible. Is there any way you could put a link up with Academic Libraries
What I would
Association?
do actually, when I return to work next week, I will speak to the academic who was really instrumental in putting that piece together. She's a lecturer in our architecture department, and speak to her about whether there is any possibility of this going up online, even just for a small period, so people can see it. We had a viewing within the institution where we were able to go along and view this, but as far as I'm aware, it's never been up online anywhere. I think it's probably something to do with copyright, or the music and the image rights and all of this kind of stuff. But I will talk to her when I get back to work, and if it is at all possible, then I can send details to the committee, who can then forward that if that's of interest.
Just somebody had their hand up at the back there on the left. Yeah.
Hi, thank you very much. Lisa Lambert is my name. I work in the Crown Institute in Trinity College. What you showed was really very interesting in terms of disaster recovery, but I'm assuming you wouldn't want to have to get there in the first place. So I'm wondering what kind of facilities were in place before, and if that has informed what's there now.
Yeah, the facilities. This is why I feel actually very, very positive. And looking back, I mean, this sounds incredibly facetious to say, and don't quote me on this. Don't tell my boss I've said this. But I do think that space will come back as a much better space for our students, actually, and for researchers compared to what it was. Because everything in that space was original Macintosh, because all of the furniture in that space was original Macintosh, every single chair was worth tens of thousands of pounds. It meant that that space needed to be invigilated at all times. You couldn't open it to students and allow them to study in there. We're a very small campus. There's a huge premium on study space, and students are always complaining there isn't enough study space. So you had this wonderful, evocative, atmospheric space that actually you instantly felt more studious the minute you walked into that space, that would have worked incredibly well for students, and we weren't able to open it up to them. We certainly didn't have enough staff to have that open, to have someone permanently based across there. Over the years, the school had made attempts to put things like Wi-Fi into the building, but obviously, again, you're dealing with a legacy building, and these systems are never as good as you would like them to be. So the idea when we come back in 2019 is that this essentially will be a replica, so we don't have to worry about insurance values anymore to a certain extent. All of the books in the library will be locked away because the cabinets that Macintosh designed are lockable cabinets, so we're not worried about that necessarily. So the idea is that really this space will be open to our students during core opening hours of 8 in the morning through till 10 o'clock at night. They will not need to make an appointment to come and view items within the library. They will not need to make an appointment to use that space as a study space. Obviously, we'll monitor it to make sure that the space is being used respectfully. I have absolute confidence in our students that it will be. The flexibility of the space will be much more in tune with the learning and teaching needs of our students. And having that extra reading room, again, above the Macintosh Library, which will be a space where we can do learning and teaching workshops. There'll be individual study spaces, but also the opportunity to push all the tables together so that we can do sessions with our artist book collection, for example, with our photography students. We did a session just earlier this week, but at the moment it's so difficult because you're having to get things from lots of remote stores. So it will come back as a much more usable space, and a space that will add so much more value to the learning and teaching experience of our students. So that is what, for me, now makes me feel very positive. Having spent a couple of years feeling thoroughly depressed about the whole process, actually, now you can see it being restored, and you can see the benefit that it's going to bring to the institution. So it's actually become a very positive response.
Thanks, Duncan. Okay, we're going to have to leave that. So another round of applause.